Mike Donovan stood on the South Boston docks watching the gray Atlantic churn. He didn't see the water. He saw a battlefield where the weak were consumed. His father's bruised knuckles were the only textbook Mike ever needed for survival. "Never wait for the strike," the old man whispered, "or you're already beaten." By age 17, Mike had survived 32 brawls in the salty alleyways. He won 28 of them because he possessed a hunter's predatory instinct. The 4 losses were his greatest teachers, showing him the cost of hesitation. He learned that action keeps you breathing, while contemplation gets you buried. When Pearl Harbor's smoke reached the mainland, Mike headed for the recruiters. They tried to stick him in the ground crew, gassing up engines for others. Mike spat on the floor and demanded a seat behind the twin 50 caliber guns. "I don't want to fix the wings," he growled. "I want to be the claws." Gunnery school was a temple of rigid mathematics and standard procedure. Instructors preached about ammunition, conservation, and waiting for the perfect lead. Mike watched the targets and saw a different geometry, the geometry of aggression. He started pulling the trigger while others were still checking their windage. "Donovan, you're a loose cannon." The lead instructor screamed during a live-fire drill. "You're wasting lead on targets that haven't even entered the effective kill zone." Mike didn't flinch as the hot brass casings rained down around his boots. "Dead gunners don't shoot back, sir," Mike replied, "and I intend to stay alive." He graduated 3rd in his class, renowned for his freakish target acquisition speed. While others calculated, Mike intercepted the very air where the enemy would be. He didn't wait for fighters to enter his zone. He hunted them at the horizon. The instructors called him reckless. The other cadets called him a ghost. March 1944, Framlingham, England. The air was thick with the scent of high-octane fuel. The 390th Bombardment Group was a collection of scarred metal and weary souls. Mike was assigned to a B-17 Flying Fortress with a demonic grin painted on its nose. They called her Hell's Fury, and she had already sent 3 crews to the hospital. The previous tail gunner, Sergeant Eddie Morrison, was being carried off on a stretcher. He wasn't wounded by flak, but his mind had shattered like cold glass in the tail. "The Reaper sits in that glass coffin," Morrison whispered to the waiting crew chief. "The next man who crawls into that seat is never coming back down to earth." Donovan heard the warning and walked straight to the aircraft without a word. He touched the cold barrels of the tail guns as if he were shaking hands with destiny. Captain James Whitmore, the pilot, watched the new recruit with a skeptical eye. "You know the statistics, kid? 38% of you boys don't finish the first tour." "Then I've got 62% odds, Captain," Donovan replied with a jagged Boston grin. "I'll take those odds because I don't plan on waiting for them to invite me to shoot." Whitmore studied the fire in Mike's eyes and saw a man who feared nothing but failure. "You're either a genius or a suicide case," Whitmore said, "but you'll fit right in." Donovan's first mission arrived on March 2, 1944, under a cold, leaden sky. The target was the ball-bearing factory at Schweinfurt, a place where bombers died. Mike crawled into the tail, feeling the vibration of the 4 Wright Cyclone engines. He checked his belts and felt the weight of 2,000 rounds of armor-piercing death. High over the German border, the call came. Fighters. 12 o'clock. 12 bandits. 12 Me-109s began to form an echelon attack pattern at the formation's rear. Standard doctrine said, "Wait until they commit. Conserve your fire for the dive." Donovan ignored the doctrine and opened fire at a staggering 2,000 yards out. Tracers arched across the blue void like red-hot needles stitching the sky together. The German pilots flared their wings in panic, blinded by the unexpected barrage. Their coordinated attack disintegrated before a single German cannon could find its mark. "Donovan, cease fire," Whitmore yelled. "You're wasting our damn ammunition." "Negative, sir," Mike replied, as he watched the fighters scatter like frightened birds. "I'm not wasting lead. I'm buying us the initiative and keeping them off balance." He had just proven that one. Burst at extreme range could save a 10,000-pound aircraft. The math of the Donovan Doctrine was being written in the clouds of Germany. On the second mission, Mike decided to experiment with the psychology of the wingman. He didn't target the lead fighter, the ace who expected the most defensive fire. He targeted the second man in the formation, the one focused on keeping his position. The wingman exploded in a ball of orange flame, and the lead pilot fled in terror. Back at the base, Sergeant Frank Murphy, the crew chief, counted the empty boxes. You used 1,600 rounds on a single engagement, Donovan. You're nearly dry. Mike wiped the black carbon from his face and looked at the pristine, unhit tail. And we didn't take a single hit. Murphy, I'll trade lead for lives any day. That night in the barracks, Mike studied the German Staffel attack maneuvers. He realized the Germans dictated the pace because American gunners were purely reactive. If we attack their formation before they attack ours, the advantage shifts, Mike noted. He began drawing diagrams of interception zones that defied every manual he'd read. March 6, 1944, the mission to Augsburg was labeled as a maximum effort strike. 800 B-17s were going in, and intelligence predicted a slaughter from the Luftwaffe. Whitmore gathered the crew, his face pale in the dim light of the briefing room. This one is going to be rough, boys. Some of us aren't coming home today. Donovan raised his hand, his voice steady amidst the nervous murmurs of the men. Sir, I want permission to engage any fighter that even looks at us from the horizon. You'll be out of ammo before we hit the target, the navigator warned with a scowl. Or I'll make sure they're too scared to follow us to the target, Mike countered. Whitmore considered the risk, looking at the bullet-free tail of his flying fortress. You've got one chance, Donovan. If you run dry and they swarm us, it's on you. They took off at 06 for 7 hours, the heavy bombers lumbering into the English mist. Mike sat in the tail, a lone sentinel watching the world fade away beneath him. At 0919, the radar operator's voice crackled. 12 bandits, 6 o'clock high. The Me-109s were forming up for their textbook-coordinated assault on the tail. Donovan didn't wait for them to dive. He unleashed a sustained, terrifying barrage. The tracers didn't just fly. They seemed to hunt the German formation center. The German lead pilot pulled hard right, his cockpit glass shattered by a stray round. The entire attack pattern dissolved into chaos as the fighters struggled to avoid the fire. You're wasting it, Mike, Whitmore shouted as the guns continued their rhythmic roar. I'm breaking their will, Captain. Just watch the horizon and keep her steady. The Germans regrouped, but now they approached with a newfound hesitant caution. The initiative had shifted. The predators were now feeling like the hunted prey. Donovan tracked a veteran pilot who tried to dive through the storm of metal. He waited until 1,100 yards, then delivered a concentrated wall of armor-piercing lead. The German's engine exploded, sending shards of metal into his own wingman. Good kill! Donovan just splashed one. The radio operator cheered over the line, but Mike wasn't celebrating. His eyes were already scanning for the next threat. He knew the Germans were angry now, and the next wave would be twice as large. The remaining 11 fighters attempted to split their focus, attacking from 2 angles. 6 from the stern, 5 from the flank, hoping to divide Donovan's lethal attention. Tommy, Carl, hold the flanks. Mike barked to the waist gunners in the middle. I'm staying on the 6. I'm going to melt their formation before they touch us. He ignored the flankers and focused every ounce of fire on the lead stern attacker. At 800 yards, his rounds found the fuel line of the primary German aggressor. The plane became a fireball, forcing the trailing fighters to fly through the debris. The entire group broke off, fleeing from a single tailgun position in total retreat. Donovan checked his boxes. He had 800 rounds left for the rest of the mission. It was a gamble that would make any sane man's blood run cold in his veins. The formation flew on toward Augsburg, the target growing closer with every mile. Then, the radar operator's voice turned to a whisper. My God, Tate contacts. A full group of 48 fighters was closing in on the lone isolated bomber. Hell's Fury had drifted from the main formation, leaving her vulnerable and alone. We can't defend against 50-1, Mike, Whitmore yelled, his voice cracking. We don't defend, Captain, Mike growled. We attack. Give me the permission. Donovan didn't aim for specific planes. He targeted the coordination points of the swarm, poured 200 rounds into the very heart of the approaching mass of German steel. The effect was psychological warfare at its finest, causing a mass panic in the air. 2 Germans collided, trying to dodge the tracers, falling like stones to the earth. The massive swarm disintegrated, 48 fighters scattering in every direction. They weren't fighting a bomber, they were fighting a ghost that defied every rule. But the Germans regrouped faster than expected, their fury overriding their fear. They dove simultaneously from every stern quarter, a wall of cannon fire approaching. Donovan didn't flinch as 20mm rounds began to stitch holes in his plexiglass. He picked the psychological center of the pack and unleashed his final sustained bursts. Target burst, target burst. He was a machine, devoid of fear and hesitation. Another Bf-109 fell, its pilot bailing out into the freezing, chaotic air. The range closed to 400 yards point-blank range for the heavy machine guns. Donovan saw the eyes of a young German pilot through the sights of his twin 50. He didn't feel pity. He only felt the recoil of the guns and the heat of the brass. He pulled the trigger, and the German's cockpit vanished in a spray of oil and glass. 2 more fighters exploded as they tried to pull out of their high-speed dives. The survivors broke off at 100 yards, terrified of a collision with the demon tail. Donovan pulled the trigger one last time, but all he heard was the hollow click. "I'm dry," he shouted over the intercom. "I'm out of ammo on all guns." The crew held their breath as the Germans regrouped for what should be the final kill. The tail was silent, and the Luftwaffe pilots knew the bomber was now defenseless. They lined up in a slow, methodical row for a classic stern-quarter execution. Donovan watched them through the glass, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't hide in the armored seat, grabbed the handles of the empty guns. He tracked the lead German with terrifying precision, pretending to aim for the kill. The German pilot saw the barrels following him, moving with lethal, calm intent. He remembered the 12 brothers he'd just seen die, and his courage vanished. The lead fighter broke formation in a panic, diving away from the loaded guns. The rest of the squadron followed their leader, convinced the trap was still set. "They're breaking off." The ball turret gunner screamed in pure, disbelief-filled joy. "They're actually running away from empty guns," the navigator added, laughing. Hell's Fury continued to the target, dropped her payload, and turned for home. The German radio waves were filled with warnings about the insane tail gunner. Not a single fighter engaged them on the return trip across the occupied channel. Reputation had become a more effective shield than armor plating ever could be. They landed at 16:47 hours, the tires screeching on the English tarmac once more. Mike Donovan climbed out of the tail, his hands steady as he lit a cigarette. The ground crew counted 47 bullet holes and 13 jagged cannon strikes. But the tail gunner's seat was untouched, a miracle of aggression in physics. Sergeant Murphy examined the empty ammunition boxes, shaking his head in awe. "You used every single round we gave you, Donovan. Not a single bullet left." "I didn't have enough to waste any, Murphy," Mike said, blowing smoke into the air. 12 confirmed kills, Whitmore said, walking up with a look of pure respect. The news spread through the 8th Air Force like a wildfire in a dry forest. Every tail gunner wanted to know the secret of the man who broke 48 fighters. By morning, high-ranking officers were arriving at the base to interview the boy. Major General Frederick Anderson arrived personally to see the South Boston hero.